Let's go to Amman in Jordan and speak to Xavier Abu Eid, the political scientist, a former communications advisor to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Xavier, you were with us on October the 7th. We were having special coverage of the second anniversary of Israel's attacks on Gaza. As you were with us in the studio, did you think that this would happen that quickly?
Good morning, Adnan. I think we have to be able to understand the difference between a peace process, a ceasefire deal, or just a deal to exchange prisoners for captives. Because so far, the possibility of having something like what we are commenting on now was always there. And I think one of the things that Adnan, you and I were talking about was that it's up to President Trump to put the right pressure. It was actually up to one phone call from President Trump to do what's happening now, but a long time ago, a year ago, almost 2 years ago. This is not something that didn't happen. Let's remember that very soon we are going to have the election of the Nobel Peace Prize. What's going to happen if President Trump doesn't get the Peace Prize? I mean, I think he was really pushing this in order to get the Peace Prize himself. Now, we have to understand also that over the past few hours since this was announced, we've had 3 different readings of what happened. So if you read what President Trump was saying and the U.S. officials, they talk about a peace plan. If you read to what Qatar, for example, which will played a major role in the mediation, they talk mainly about a ceasefire. And if you look at Hamas, they talk about an agreement to end the war in Gaza. But they are careful not to mention all of Palestine. If you read the statement of the U.S. administration, they don't mention the term Palestinian or Palestine. So I think Mohammed al-Qasem was presenting a very important question previously. Who is going to rule Gaza after this? So in other words, I think we are at the same stage, but that we were talking about with regards to the possibility of having an exchange of captives for Palestinian detainees, a withdrawal of Israel from important parts of Gaza, but not from all of Gaza. At the same time, that we need to be very careful with regards to the technicalities. So that's why I believe, Adnan, that it's very important to be cautious at the same time that we should fully understand why people in Gaza are celebrating at this point.
It'll be really interesting to see the reaction and analyses on more Western-orientated channels, Xavier, because you, like everybody else we have spoken to in the past few hours, says this is a more delicate moment than we actually understand, that there is so much more that we need to know before we can confirm that this will lead to a permanent peace. It also requires, does it not, a complete change of mindset from the Israeli leadership. When this conflict began, we spoke to a senior member of the Hamas Politburo. Osama Hamdan said to us, we decided that we were going to attack Israel because they have been attacking us for decades and killing us for decades, and we realized that they would continue to kill us, so we may as well die while they're killing us. That was Hamdan's justification for the October the 7th attacks in 2023 in Israeli territory. That means that the Israeli leadership and the state needs to change its entire approach to Palestinian existence, doesn't it?
We may want to add that Hamas is at no place at this stage in order to conduct any sort of military operation like the one conducted on October the 7th. And we should also add to this, Adnan, something which is very important, which is that many Palestinians, particularly Palestinians in Gaza, are going to be looking forward now for some answers from Hamas itself. This is not to take the blame from the Israeli occupation, from the genocide that they have been conducting, but also it's important for Palestinians and particularly people in Gaza to hear from Hamas about what they were thinking on October the 7th and what were their plans. And if October the 7th did not go out of their own control. Now, I think there will be, of course, a big difference between people in this region and people that are more Western-oriented for a very simple reason. Because we have been witnessing for the past 30 years agreements that are signed with Israel that are permanently violated. And if we're going to talk about the Trump administration itself, let's remember what a party they organized when they reached a ceasefire deal between Lebanon and Israel. And now we've had Lebanon attack almost 2,000 times since this ceasefire deal was reached only just a few months ago. So So far, it's not like they have switched the Israeli government to its current extremist composition, that they have brought people that believe in a two-state solution instead of Smotrich and Ben Gvir. It's like Netanyahu now becomes the head of the Israeli peace camp. No, 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 no. Absolutely nothing has changed. What we have now, it was a miscalculation of Benjamin Netanyahu that attacked Qatar, that changed the conditions for President Donald Trump, that got really involved in the negotiations. Now Benjamin Netanyahu realizes that he's also out of options. So he had to say yes to President Trump. But Netanyahu understands very well that after the first photo opportunity, after the announcement of this deal, after the exchange of the prisoners and captives, and particularly after the return of all Israelis that are still in Gaza to their homes in Israel, there will be a different scenario. And I think he's counting on this because, as your coverage in TRT has been explaining very well, Israel, Netanyahu himself, did not want this deal to keep going.
Well, it could be also critical, Xavier, that those two far-right ministers that you mentioned, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, are believed to have said that if the Prime Minister Netanyahu accepted the ceasefire deal, that they would remain in the government, because there was always the threat of a collapse if those two ministers withdrew their support from Netanyahu's right-wing coalition. But in terms of the future governance of Gaza, as we were speaking earlier with Mohammed Al-Qasim, and you were listening, I believe, if the Israelis are not happy with either the Palestinian Authority or Hamas being in charge of Gaza, where does that leave Palestinian self-determination?
Well, Israel has a very clear position against the Palestinian right to self-determination. And that's why they oppose any sort of Palestinian leadership, whether you can call it Hamas or you can call it the PA. Now, I think it's very important that to understand, once again, the details of any agreement, because eventually what you could have is a framework at this stage. The Arab world is not willing to, for example, intervene heavily in Gaza, including Gulf countries, if it will not be linked to a political solution. And the only way you have to link it to a political solution is to have one single Palestinian government, both in the West Bank and Gaza, that will represent all Palestinians and will be in charge of the reconstruction. So if the PA is not going to be allowed into Gaza, this is also a problem. At the same time, Adnan, it's important that to emphasize that the right to self-determination means that Palestinians themselves are those that should decide on what is going to happen next with their own country. In other words, how this would leave the idea of having this quote-unquote board of peace with people like Tony Blair involved in the reconstruction of Gaza, even in the governance of Gaza, in the legislation of Gaza. In other words, this plan sets some elements, as we were speaking a few days ago, that actually take us further away from a Palestinian state. But we can fully understand why people are celebrating at this stage, and over the past few days, at least, where we should be witnessing an end to the daily massacres and war crimes of the Israeli occupation, at the same time that many of us are looking forward for Palestinian prisoners that will be released, and perhaps someone like Marouane Barghouti, the most popular Palestinian leader who remains in Israeli jails, will be able to get back home, or at least to be free after almost 2 decades in Israeli prisons.
And you mentioned the occupied West Bank, the fact that at the moment, none of the details that we've heard actually mention the greater territory that constitutes the state of Palestine. And we know that the Israeli military, as well as illegal settlers, have dramatically increased their raids and attacks against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. If there is no mention of the OWB in the final 20-phase agreement, does that mean that almost it won't survive? Because after all, everything we've talked about over the past couple of years is that this conflict and the killing of 67,000 plus people has brought the two-state solution back to the forefront of international relations.
I think without the West Bank, Adnan, will be impossible to have a real solution here. But at the same time, we have to understand that in Gaza, Israel's genocidal war has destroyed over 90% of Gaza. So there is a lot of work to be done in Gaza, and people could focus over there. That's why it's important to be cautious and not to refer to what we are witnessing now as a peace plan. This is not a peace plan. This is something focused on Gaza, and I will say something a bit responsible, if you may, Adnan, with regards to President Trump, because I don't have information. Usually, when we analyze, I like to have concrete facts. But I could just guess that the timing of what happened deals heavily with the idea of the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think there is a very good question to be asked. What's going to happen if he doesn't get the Peace Prize? I think also this is an element to look into.
You're absolutely right, Xavier, and it's definitely worth speculating on that because we're coming to the moment when the Nobel Committee will announce who the winner of this year's Peace Prize is. Xavier Abu Eid, you know how much we appreciate your participation and your analysis. It's important for our viewers. Thank you very much.